the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. He's had a career-long commitment to ideas about free speech issues that began with his time working at the American Civil Liberties Union. But today we're going to talk about it from a particular perspective he's been writing from recently. His most recent book, and he's written several, which was written along with social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, is called The Coddling of the American Mind: How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. And the book came out in September of this year, 2018.
And one of the central ideas of the book, and Greg, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
And one of the central themes of the book, Greg, is what you call the untruth of fragility. The thought that if somebody says something the wrong way and you have to hear it, you're harmed. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure, and it leads to a misunderstanding, particularly when people, are only familiar with the title, which, by the way, we didn't choose, or know a little bit about the book, but not all that much. And I always have to explain, so you're saying students are fragile? And my response is, no, that's absolutely not what we're saying. We're saying that children, young people are naturally anti-fragile. Generally, we have a great capacity to benefit from, the wonderful kind of verbal sparring and conflict I got to enjoy while a student at Stanford. But you can create a negative, self-reinforcing, self-fulfilling prophecy if you tell people that they can actually be relatively easily hurt by words, ideas, exposure to even, movies or books that contain things that might be uncomfortable, disagreeable, or in some way what is known as triggering. So I think one thing I'm really trying to stress in the book is that, first of all, this isn't something that I think students are bringing on their own. I think this is something that we've created environments that unfortunately promote this manner of thinking, which can actually lead to situations of increased anxiety, increased depression, which we've seen in fairly dramatic fashion in the data just over the past few years.
So that's one of the reasons I guess you call it the untruth of fragility, that the truth is people are resilient. And Joe, I wonder if you might jump in here a little bit, because you've done some work on the psychology of triggering as well, and its relationship to past trauma that folks have experienced. And what have you found in that?
Yeah, well, what I found, and this is really true of what psychology's found, and it's reflected, I might say, quite ably in the book. Of course, your co-author is a psychologist, is that people have kind of trauma backwards a little bit. Trauma is awful, and people suffer trauma. But the cure for trauma, very generally, is actually exposure rather than avoidance. So to the extent that people have had trauma, we actually don't want to remove them from the real world, so to speak. And there's also a mistake about what trauma is, at least from a clinical sense. Merely feeling really hurt about something or sitting with a painful feeling is not the same as trauma.
And Greg, I wonder if we could go back to something you said about triggering, which is I tend, for example, I teach a class at the law school, a torts class, where one of the cases that we look at over the course of the quarter is a case that involves a really quite tragic obstetrical accident, and a child is born with tremendous brain damage and the like. And one of the things I show the students in the class is what's called a day in the life movie that was prepared by the lawyers. It's not a problem to say to students beforehand, you're going to watch a movie that has some very upsetting stuff in it, right? That's not what you mean by triggering. What's the concern that you have?
Well, it's interesting because, this came from an article that Haidt and I wrote back in 2015. And basically we were pushing back against sort of the medicalization of rationales for censorship. And saying, listen, this is actually not very good science. If you're actually saying that the goal should be to, get rid of anything that could potentially be triggering or difficult. And at the time, trigger warnings were a very big hot topic. And I think we've been a little bit portrayed as if our major, what we're saying is trigger warnings are bad, like something like really a primitive version of what we're saying. But really more what we're saying is that there's, and when I get to explain this, and I've had to explain this sometimes to, students who are crying in front of me, is that there's no evidence that they're helpful meaningfully. There's mainstream reasons to think, as Professor Bankman pointed out, that they could be harmful. They could actually play into a situation of heightened fear rather than the reverse. And incidentally, one of the few studies that's been done on trigger warnings shows that, or at least it's not decisive, but showed that that does in fact happen. It actually can heighten the sense of anxiety around particular issues. And then, of course, there's the concern that Professor Bankman opened up with, which is that then you also have to think about what it does to the academic environment. At the same time, I'm the president of FIRE. I defend free speech and academic freedom. So if people want to provide warnings before any material, we defend their right to do that. But the question, which I think can be reasonably asked, is when is the appropriate time to do it, and how much does it help?
So the kinds of things that people have started to treat as triggering and on college campuses seems to have expanded dramatically over the last generation or so. That is, from, we're going to be discussing rape today in class, let's be careful about what we say, to now things like any book that illustrates an upsetting event for the protagonist of the book, you need to warn people, or you need to give people alternative reading assignments or the like. And is that what the real concern is here?
Oh, that definitely concept creep is a major theme of the book. And what was interesting to me, working on campuses, because I started working at FIRE just a year after I graduated from the law school, and the stereotype of campus, was that students were demanding, politically correct, a term I don't particularly like, censorship. And for the overwhelming majority of my career, it was absolutely nothing like that. The students were the best defenders of free speech. They were certainly better than administrators, and generally better than, unfortunately, in a lot of cases, professors. They got it. They got, that everything from offensive jokes to difficult books were couldn't be banned or prevented. But the reason why we wrote the book and we investigated generational differences so deeply in it is because working in this field, there seemed to be a real sudden shift sometime around 2013, 2014. And you do start seeing ideas of triggering applied to, take a look at the policy they actually passed at Oberlin, but then was immediately overturned when the faculty found out how expansive it was. It wasn't just recommending that professors offer trigger warnings. It was wholesale recommending that professors avoid topics that pertain to that involve racism, classism, sexism, cisgenderism. That really, by the time you finished the list, it left you with barely anything to talk about. Now, thankfully, the professors in this case revolted and immediately got rid of the policy. But it does show that some of these concerns that sometimes get treated as a sort of slippery slope fallacy aren't so much a fallacy. And in the previous iteration of the existence of trigger warnings online, by about 2012, because different parts of the blogosphere had been using trigger warnings to discuss the difficult materials for quite some time. But by 2012, there were people who were otherwise supportive of trigger warnings, but saying that these have kind of turned into a joke. And she wrote in I think it was a New Republic about it, that there was now dozens and dozens of things that they were being requested trigger warnings for, including something like small holes or something like that. So it's an original iteration. It did have a tendency to sort of concept creep away, and you see a little bit of that. Actually, when you get beyond trigger warnings to other things that can get you in trouble, unfortunately, I see a lot of that in my work.
This is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking with our guest, Greg Lukianoff, about his new book, The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. Joe?
Greg, I want to jump in and, first of all, kind of amplify some of the things you're saying, and then I think I'm going to, along with Pam, kind of challenge you about how you would handle some hard issues. Mm-hmm. So first, the amplification. If you're going to talk about a subject, and as you point out, almost any subject has a capacity to confront very strong feelings in people, at least in law schools. We talk about a lot of controversial subjects. If you've got to be super careful about what you say, a natural instinct is to self-censor, because you have to ask yourself, is it worth spending an extra hour to say this these 5 sentences in the correct way? Or should I just move on? Can I be more useful as an instructor doing something else? And so I think the real censorship that's going on, if we'd call it censorship, is self-censorship in the face of just not wanting to deal with the blowback if you get it.
Mm-hmm. No, and I've seen that, and I've heard that an awful lot when I speak on different campuses. Having some prominent professors when our original article came out, saying, Jay Rosen, wrote, "I self-censor in class," and it's actually gotten worse. To answer something that Professor Carlin brought up earlier in the podcast, because in my experience, there was always a little bit of worry. I didn't see any cases like this at Stanford, but at other universities, where professors had to worry a little bit about saying something that might be a bad public relations deal for the university. And I saw plenty of cases where professors got in trouble for saying things that led to PR headaches for the head office. Then you also have to worry about things that the legal department, doesn't like, thinks could potentially lead to some kind of, usually fairly frivolous and sort of exaggerated sense of legal claims. More recently, I've definitely seen an uptick in professors being afraid that their students might overreact, and that's not completely unwarranted, unfortunately. We have seen an uptick in cases like that. But the most recent trend that really puts professors in a bind, in my opinion, is the rise of the sort of conservative internet troll. Not strictly conservative. There's of course, unfortunately, there's equal opportunity trolls all over the place. But when someone posts something on Facebook, goes on a TV show, puts something out on Twitter, will make it their mission to get people together to try to get that professor fired. And sometimes universities actually comply, as in the case of Lisa Durden, one of the cases we talk about in the book.
This is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking with Greg Lukianoff about the climate on campus and his recent book, The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting up a generation for failure. And one of the things that you just touched on this, Greg, and I wanted to come back to it a little, is I think liberals think this is all about conservatives, and conservatives think this is all about liberals. But your book kind of makes the point that this is an equal opportunity offense.
It's kind of all over the place, because there's a chapter all the way at the end that talks about all the cases that aren't particularly ideological at all, that are more like general power struggles, or someone in the legal office, at a university just being convinced that they need to have, and this is, by the way, this is not an exaggeration, this is a real example, a 20-foot wide gazebo at a school of 28,000 students as the sole place where you can engage in quote-unquote free speech activities. An awful lot of my career has involved cases that don't fit sort of people's preconceptions of what free speech cases on campus would look like. That, to be fair, you do have the cases where it's a conservative professor getting in trouble for saying something that might not be politically correct, and that does happen. But more often, what I see on campus is usually, a professor who would also consider themselves on the left getting in trouble for saying something that they generally had no idea was offensive, or maybe they were trying to push some limits, but in a way that they'd always done for decades before it. Like I said, more recently, we've seen a lot more cases of professors saying things, off on their free time and having people coming after them. Probably the most interesting one that didn't make the book, because it happened just like right after we handed in the manuscript, which always happens, the final manuscript, was Jim Livingston. He's a professor at Rutgers University. And he, like all New Yorkers do, he complained about gentrification, particularly when he was in Harlem, because there were a bunch of white teenagers acting what he thought was obnoxiously. So he goes on Facebook and he says, "I want to resign from the white race," and it's a fairly angry, mini tirade, but it sounds very, very typical to a lot of people I know living in New York. And he was found guilty of racial harassment of white students, even though it wasn't directed at anybody. And he was complaining about something that New Yorkers complain about all the time. And we had to get involved in that case. But it was one of the perfect examples of how sometimes these cases don't look anything like I think people would expect them to.
Greg, let me jump in here. And
Sure.
I think that we've kind of set the stage for a lot of listeners saying, hey, that sounds really bad. You're telling us that a white person could be convicted of saying something anti-white that just doesn't correspond to common sense here. What do you do about the real-life situation that often comes up, I think, where you've got an administration that really cares about diversity, and they want minority students to feel comfortable in a place that might not feel comfortable for them, frankly. There are going to be outsiders there. They're outsiders in society, maybe generally. So the instinct is to have a very supportive environment, but you've got some hot button topics like affirmative action. So what should schools be doing on that? Is there a difference between debating affirmative action not face to face, debating it in front of somebody who might be admitted because of that? How do you deal with the kind of tension between respecting someone's feelings and wanting them to feel good, wanting to have an open debate?
I think the first thing that most schools do wrong is we don't set expectations very well. Now, law schools generally, project us by their very nature that this, if done right, we're going to talk about controversial issues. We're going to probably hit some things that really hit home and can be really uncomfortable for students from different backgrounds. But at an undergraduate level, which a lot of what we're talking about in the book it deals with undergraduate education, that sort of larger university trigger warning, the part of the orientation where they say this is going to be uncomfortable, we're going to be talking about difficult things if we're doing it right. If we actually have a healthy, vibrant environment, you're going to hear opinions that you think are downright offensive, probably. And I think that what we've done on some campuses is we've made the expectation something more, partially because administrators, for the most part, are the people in charge of orientations, and faculty at a lot of schools have almost nothing to do with orientation. They really emphasize the inclusion and comfort aspect of it without doing any prep work to say, listen, that's not all this is. This is a very special place that, done correctly, frankly, is going to be kind of difficult sometimes, and done correctly can actually be really uncomfortable. So I'm a big advocate for doing a better job of educating people about some of these ideas much earlier on, high school. I think every school in the country should have some kind of orientation program that talks about the deep philosophy behind freedom of inquiry, academic freedom, and for that matter, even the value that you occasionally have with the great provocateurs like Lenny Bruce. So I think that there's ways you can create expectations that help some of those circumstances. It doesn't eliminate them, because there's no way really to completely eliminate them and still have a rigorous education, but I think creating the right expectations can help.
We'll be back with more from our guest, Greg Lukianoff, about climate on campus and his book, The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure, next on Stanford Legal on Sirius XM Insight 121.